Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Okay, we've just heard from John F. Kennedy there talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to cover in this video the paper 2, which includes superpower relations and the Cold War 1941 to 1991. We're going to talk about that in today's video. The paper also includes the Tudor depth options. For us, that's Elizabeth I. We're not going to talk about that one today. We'll talk about that in a separate video. But it is in the same paper, which is paper 2, which is the second paper that you will do. You'll notice that the assessment takes an hour and 45 minutes. You need to split your time roughly between the two units, so the bit we're going to talk about today should take you just over 50 minutes. Okay, so the paper, you've got all the same instructions that you always get on the front. Look at this one very carefully. There are 2 sections in this question paper. Answer all questions from section A and either question 4 or 5 from question B. So for the one that we're going to do, you're answering all of the questions that are in there. Look at this bit too. Answer the questions in the spaces provided. There may be more space than you need. So it's a rough guide to show how much space you're going to need. Then it tells us the paper's out of 64. That is more than paper 1 and 2 because remember this paper has got 2 different topics in it. So it's worth slightly more. This is a really important exam, so it's important that you take this one just as seriously as you would medicine and Germany. Then it tells us the marks are shown in brackets, which give us a bit of an idea how long to spend on each one. And then it says read each question carefully before you start to answer it. Try to divide your time equally between each section and check your answers if you have time at the end. All very sensible stuff. So the first question in the paper is an explain to consequences question. It's always explain to consequences. This entire paper is very focused on cause and consequence. So causes obviously the things that make something happen. Consequences are obviously results, impacts, outcomes of a particular event. This one in particular looks at the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis and it is an 8-mark question. Before we look at how to answer it, let's just look at how much space you get. So on this paper, because it's a sample, it says at the bottom, the live question paper will have 4 more answer lines per consequence. So there will be 4 extra lines at the bottom of consequence 2 on another page. So you need to write a fairly decent sized paragraph on each of the consequences. Okay, how do you go about actually answering the question? Let's have a little look. So quite simply, what you need to do is you need to think of 2 things that are very different from each other that are outcomes of the event that you are looking at. You don't want to describe the event that you're looking at. You don't want to say what caused the event you're looking at. You're looking at outcomes, consequences, results. So you start off with a very clear topic sentence. And your topic sentence is going to say a clear outcome of the event. So mine says, one consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis 1962 was that it led to a de-escalation, so a downturn or things got better on the nuclear aspect of the Cold War. Then what I've got underneath is very clear and specific detailed facts to back up the point and to prove that our topic sentence is true. So here I've put the Soviet Union did remove their missiles from Cuba and the USA eventually removed their missiles from Turkey, thus satisfying the agreement made at the end of the crisis. So I've tried to link it back to the event. In 1963, both sides agreed to the Limited Test Ban Treaty. This said that they would only test nuclear weapons underground, so that's very detailed. And then I've said the crisis had also showed that a lack of technology made it difficult to communicate, and for this reason a hotline was introduced that connected Moscow to Washington. This symbolised an improvement in relations, making nuclear war less likely, and I've linked my end sentence there back to the same words that I used in the topic sentence. Next, I've come up with a very separate point. This one is about the consequence it had on the political careers of those who were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I've said Kennedy was seen by many as a strong leader who had handled the crisis well, since he had remained composed and strong, forcing the USSR into an agreement where they had to publicly back down while the US could do so in secretly. So I've said what caused him to look strong. And then I've said, however, that this reflected badly on Khrushchev, who had perhaps underestimated Kennedy, and it led to him being dismissed in 1964. So I've ended on a consequence there. I don't need to do anything else. I just need to give 2 clear consequences and then facts to back it up and show that there was a consequence. Just be careful with this one. You don't want to describe the event. You want to make sure your 2 consequences are very different to each other, and you don't want to talk about the causes. You want to talk about the results, so the outcomes of the event. Be specific and detailed in the examples that you give, making sure to use dates, key events, key figures, etc. So that question was worth about 8 marks. 8 marks exactly. So you're going to spend about 10 to 12 minutes on that question, hopefully just 10 because it's quite straightforward. Okay, next we've got the narrative account question. So write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Berlin crisis 1948 to 49. What's really important here is that we look at the dates 1948 to 1949. So we're not talking about things that happened before 1948, like for example, you could have said the Potsdam Conference caused the Berlin crisis, but you're not going to do that. And you're not going to talk about anything after 1949, so you're not going to say the Warsaw Pact was an outcome of it. You're going to try to be very specific to the event that is in the question. You're going to make sure that you are linking together the different causes and consequences throughout, because you're trying to show that not only do you actually understand what happened during the event, but if we have a little look at the mark scheme, you're also showing that you understand the causation, consequences and changes that take place. And what that means is you can show how the different parts of the event link together. Okay. So the first thing that I do when I'm actually answering this question is I'm going to write down another bullet point for what I'm going to include. So it's already given me Stalin's fears and the airlift for the Berlin crisis. You must also use your information. Your own information rather. You must use your own information. So if you don't do that, then you're not going to get very good marks on this question. So you must make sure you put in something that isn't in the bullet points. Okay, so how I've written this is I've tried to use as much connective language as I possibly can all the way through. And I've highlighted some of those connectives in red so that you can see them there. So it starts off by saying the first key event was the Berlin crisis. I'll let you read this one by yourself. I've gone into quite a lot of detail about what the first event was, and then I've said, as a result, Stalin felt that he needed to force the Western powers out of Berlin. So I've linked together the fact that he's afraid and the fact that they are threatening him to the fact that he starts the blockade. Then I go on to say what exactly the blockade was. And then I say what the consequence of that was. And again, I say the consequence. So I'm using linking language all the time. The details that I give are really specific. So I talk about them delivering 4,000 tons and landing a plane every 3 minutes. And then I say this determination meant that it was clear Stalin's plan hadn't worked. That should say. So then I've got clearly a first event, a link to the second event, and then a clear second event. Arguably, I've actually got 3 events in there because I've got causes, the blockade, and I've got the airlift. So I've gone above and beyond. Now I'm going to finish off by saying what the consequence of the airlift was to round it off without going beyond 1949. So I've said that he stops the blockade, and then I've given a fact about the fact that Germany is divided into East and West, and then I've just finished it off with a nice rounding off sentence, this one here. The crisis therefore showed there was a bitter divide and deep suspicion between democracy and communism, that Germany would be a symbol of division. So that's a nice sort of rounding off sentence. In theory, I don't really need it because I've actually given my whole account there, but I think that just shows the examiner that you fully understand what you're doing. Okay, so again, this is an 8-mark question. Remember, you've got a key event, a link, a key event, a link, and then another key event. And you need to think of this one as a chain. You're showing how all the bits of the story join up together to make the story. So it's an 8-mark question, so you're going to spend about 10 to 12 minutes on it. Again, you get the same amount of paper for this one. You're going to have one full piece of paper and then another full piece of paper. So you've got 2 pages basically to answer it. So we're looking for 3 very good sized paragraphs. Okay, so the last question on this section is worth 16 marks. It's quite odd because you get to pick from 2 different events of 3 events. and you need to decide which two you're going to answer. They're all worth 8 marks, and the two events together join up to be 16 marks. So it's a 16-mark question, but in 2 halves. It's quite odd, but actually quite good, because if we look closely, the mark scheme actually says you must explain two of the following. NB, so this is to the marker, the person that's going to mark your paper. Mark each part of the answer separately, 2 times 8 marks. So that means if you only knew really, really well about one of the events, then you could still get 8 marks, even if you couldn't really write anything for the second part of the answer. So that's a really, really nice aspect to this question. However, obviously you should answer both parts and have brilliant knowledge when you go into the exam so that you could answer any one of them brilliantly. So the next thing I need to point out really is that you need to make sure you don't answer all 3. If you say what's important about all 3, you won't get any more marks. It won't get you anywhere. They'll just ignore one entire answer. The paper is really good at reminding you of this fact because it asks you to put a cross for your first choice and then write your answer underneath, and you'll get 2 pages for that. And then it asks you to say what your second choice is, and then you get 2 pages for that. So you're kind of led by the exam paper to try to stop you from accidentally writing too much. So that's really good. Okay, so this is actually a really simple format. All that you need to do is you need to give 2 clear peel paragraphs that are about the importance or impact or consequences of the event. So if something's important, it means that it had a big effect on the world. So you need to talk about what was important about it, what the effect of the event was. So this is back to consequences again. It even tells you here in the mark scheme, analysis of second order concepts, consequence and significance. So it's asking you to tell me why an event is significant. You must make sure that you also have specific details and facts as always. Okay, so how do you actually answer it? So this is a classic point evidence explained, but the focus of it is on the importance of the event. So let's have a look. So my clear point here is that the Hungarian uprising of 1956 was important because it led to a tightening of control of the Eastern Bloc. And then I've given specific facts. I've said that Khrushchev had his secret speech in February 1956 and it looked as though he may be more peaceful and liberal in his approach than Stalin. However, the uprising that followed in Hungary made the USSR look weak as Nagy had asked to leave the Warsaw Pact, which held together the satellite states. Khrushchev's brutal response left 20,000 rebels dead and led to the flight of 200,000 refugees. So I've just briefly said what is it about it that meant that they managed to tighten their control on the Eastern Bloc in my evidence. So I've chosen facts that prove my point. And then I've said this was important and I've linked it back by using the same words. This was important as it meant that the other satellite states were intimidated and that Khrushchev had proven that he would deal ruthlessly with any country trying to undermine the Soviet Union control over them. So I've basically just tied it back and made my point again really clearly and said why they managed to tighten their control over the Eastern Bloc. That's all that you do when you explain. You basically just answer the question directly. And then I've given a separate second point. I've tried to pick something really different. So here I've got something about Russia and the impact on the Soviet Union and their sort of concerns in the Cold War. And then my second paragraph is about the international impact. So how did the USA respond? Okay, so for my second paragraph, I've said that the Hungarian uprising proved that the USA would not protect people in Eastern Europe if they wanted to rise against the Soviet Union. The facts that I've given are all about the fact that the US Secretary of State had said that they could count on them and then he didn't actually give them military support. And then my weakness, my conclusion, my explanation is basically saying that it was important because it strengthened Khrushchev's power in the East and any hope of a thaw in the Cold War that had been there when he'd become leader was now dead, it now ended. So again, I've linked it back to the fact that all this did was make Khrushchev more powerful. And again, I've tried to use the important twice. I've heard some teachers say that what you need to think of this question is an important sandwich. So it's basically saying oh dear, what am I doing? It's basically saying that you are starting off by saying what's important, you're giving some facts to prove it, and then you're finishing off by saying, so that makes it important because blah, blah, blah. So just try to remember that you're constantly coming back to the consequences, significance, and outcomes of the events in question 3. You don't need a conclusion. As soon as you've done your 2 paragraphs, you're just going to move straight on to your second bullet point and write your 2 paragraphs for that one too. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this section of the Paper 2 exam. I think you'll probably agree with me that actually the question types are pretty straightforward on this exam. It's really just about, are you going to have enough knowledge and the right knowledge on the day? So for Cold War, you really need to be revising and looking at how the different events link together, because every question is about that. It's about how do the events connect, how do the events have consequences for the course of the Cold War. You will also notice that you're being examined on a really small amount of the information that you know. So it's really important that you've revised the whole story in depth so that no matter what comes up, you're able to talk about it. Notice that the narrative account question is about one specific event, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis question, that's about something really specific as well. So it's really important that you revise everything, because if you get something you haven't revised here or in the narrative account one, then that's 8 whole marks that you're just not going to get, even if, you know, 2 of the things that you like come up in the 2 bullet points. You're going to have lost out already on far too much marks earlier in the paper. So please revise really thoroughly for the Cold War, as always. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's video. I just wanted to finish off by showing you the red, amber, green sheet for the Cold War, just so that you can pause and make sure that you have revised everything if you don't have this sheet at home with you at the moment. You should be using your knowledge organiser, keep going back to it to make sure that you know everything in there for each of the topics. Cold War is in there. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell your friends to watch this video. Hopefully it's been